Hey guys! Tonight, we're gonna drift a little higher than usual. You might want to dim the lights, get comfortable, and maybe pretend you're looking out a tiny spaceship window. Because tonight's story isn't about kings, queens, or inbred dynasties. It's about something a bit more cosmic. The space race. That strange Cold War chapter when humanity decided that orbiting rocks might be a better place to flex geopolitical egos than, say, actually improving life on Earth. So yeah, grab a blanket, maybe a snack, because we're going to float through one of the most expensive, dangerous, and weirdly glamorous competitions in human history, where scientists work themselves into ulcers, astronauts became accidental celebrities, and everyone pretended it was about science, when really, it was mostly about bragging rights. Let's start with a vibe check. It's 1945. The world has just finished one of its worst group projects, World War Q. Europe is smoldering, the United States is feeling pretty triumphant, and the Soviet Union has lost, about 27 million people, which is not ideal. But despite the rubble and trauma, both sides have something new and shiny: rocket scientists. Specifically, the kind who used to work for Nazi Germany. Because, plot twist, while Hitler was losing the war, he was also accidentally inventing the future of space exploration. The German V-2 rocket was the first man-made object to touch the edge of space. It was also a very expensive way to blow up London. And after the war ended, both the Americans and the Soviets wanted those rocket blueprints. And the engineers. Especially one engineer. Enter Wernher von Braun. Tall, charming, and terrifyingly good at rocket science. He was the kind of man who could explain orbital mechanics while completely ignoring the whole Nazi Party member thing. Which, awkward. The Americans snapped him up through something called Operation Paperclip, a delightful euphemism for, we're importing war criminals, but only the useful ones. Von Braun was whisked off to the United States, given a lab coat instead of a uniform, and told to start designing rockets, this time for democracy. Meanwhile, over in the Soviet Union, the mysterious engineer Sergei Korolev, known only as the chief designer, was leading the charge. Korolev was a genius. Also, a survivor of Stalin's gulags, because apparently even brilliant rocket scientists weren't immune to random imprisonment. Now out of prison and deeply motivated to never go back, Korolev pushed his team to new extremes. He wanted to send a person into space before the Americans could even get their helmets polished. And on April 12, 1961, he did it. Yuri Gagarin, 27 years old, short, charming, and had the kind of smile that makes propaganda posters practically print themselves. He climbed into a metal capsule called Vostok 1, sat on top of an enormous rocket, and just went up. He orbited Earth once. He saw the curvature of the planet. He said the famous words, "Poyekali," which means, let's go, and then returned safely. The Soviets announced it first, of course. The Americans, still catching their breath, could only stare and clap politely through gritted teeth. Yuri became an international celebrity overnight. He toured the world, hugged children, waved from balconies, and smiled that perfect "I survived" space smile. The US scrambled again because they couldn't let the Soviets keep being first at everything. They launched Alan Shepard just a few weeks later, but only on a short 15-minute suborbital flight. He went up, came down, and technically didn't even orbit the planet. Still, he was America's first man in space, which was enough to save face. Barely. At this point, the competition was less about science and more about symbolism. Space became the new chessboard. Each move was about proving whose ideology was superior, capitalism or communism, as if the stars themselves cared. Then in 1961, something big happened. A new U.S. president stepped up to the microphone, young, handsome, and very determined to look confident on television. John F. Kennedy. In a speech that would define the decade, he declared, "We choose to go to the moon not because it is easy, but because it is hard." Which sounds inspirational until you realize he basically just promised the nation a 10-year, multi-billion-dollar engineering nightmare. NASA took that as a challenge. So the Americans started building their We're Going to the Moon program. They called it Project Apollo, which sounds majestic, and it was in theory, but first they had to figure out how to get into orbit without killing anyone. That's where Project Mercury came in. A series of small missions to test whether humans could sit in tiny metal capsules for hours without losing their minds or suffocating. The astronauts, known as the Mercury 7, were chosen carefully. All military pilots, all male, all white, all with perfect square jaws, because apparently spaceflight required good cheekbones. They became instant national heroes, which was ironic because for the first few years they didn't actually fly much. They just sat for endless press conferences, G-force tests, and photo shoots with their families. NASA was still exploding rockets on the regular. Meanwhile, the Soviets kept upping the ante. They sent the first man to spend a whole day in space, then the first woman, Valentina Tereshkova, who orbited Earth 48 times in 1963. Her call sign was Chaika, meaning seagull. She later said that she didn't eat much during the mission because the food was unappetizing, which, to be fair, describes most space food even today. Valentina became a national icon, just like Gagarin. The Soviets were winning every first imaginable. But behind the scenes, Korolev was getting frustrated. The Soviet space program was underfunded, over-politicized, and increasingly chaotic. He dreamed of beating the Americans to the moon, but he was running out of time and eventually out of health. Korolev died in 1966 during surgery. His death was kept secret for years, and without him, the Soviet program started to wobble. Back in the US, things were finally looking up. Literally. NASA moved from Mercury to Project Gemini, which sounds like a zodiac sign, but it was actually the bridge to the moon program. Gemini tested spacewalks, orbital rendezvous, and other terrifying concepts like let's open the door and step outside while moving 17,000 miles per hour. The astronauts trained in swimming pools, deserts, and vacuum chambers. They practiced docking two spacecraft together, which sounds romantic, but mostly involved yelling at mission control and sweating profusely. By the mid-1960s, NASA had learned a lot, mostly how not to explode. But tragedy still struck. In 1967, during a routine test for Apollo 1, a cabin fire broke out on the launch pad. 3 astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, died in the blaze. The investigation revealed shocking design flaws, flammable materials, pure oxygen atmosphere, and a hatch that opened the wrong way. It was a devastating blow. But it forced NASA to rebuild, refocus, and take safety seriously. The world outside was shifting too. The Vietnam War was raging, civil rights protests filled the streets, and the idea of spending billions to go to the moon was, let's just say, controversial. But momentum kept building. Rockets got bigger, computers got smarter, and by 1968, the first manned Apollo missions began. The new Saturn V rocket was a monster, taller than the Statue of Liberty,
capable of launching 140 tons into orbit. It was basically a controlled explosion with seats. And for the first time, the Americans were ahead. In December 1968, Apollo 8 became the first crewed mission to orbit the moon. Astronauts Frank Borman, Jim Lovett, and Bill Anders read from Genesis while broadcasting live to millions on Earth. A surprisingly poetic moment in the middle of the Cold War. They also took one of the most famous photos in history, Earthrise, that delicate blue marble floating in the dark. It made people realize something strange. For all the competition, humanity was tiny, just one planet in a big, indifferent void.
But of course, we couldn't stay philosophical for long, because the next step was the big one, the moon landing. And that, dear listeners, is where we'll drift next, to the summer of 1969, a year of music festivals, moon boots, and televised miracles. But before we go there, maybe take a breath, because things are about to get historically heavy. Not exciting. We don't do exciting here. Just quietly monumental. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've officially survived the bureaucratic buildup to humanity's most overachieving camping trip. When we left off, it was late 1968. The Americans had orbited the moon. The Soviets had, well, not. And somewhere in Houston, an entire generation of engineers were surviving on coffee, cigarettes, and the kind of math that would make your brain quietly leave your skull. So now, let's drift into 1969, the year everything finally worked. On July 16, 1969, at 9:32 a.m. Florida time, a few 100,000 people gathered on the beaches near Cape Kennedy. Some had binoculars, some had lawn chairs. Most had no idea that the rocket they were watching, the Saturn V, contained enough explosive fuel to wipe out a small city. Inside, 3 men sat calmly, pretending this was all normal. Neil Armstrong, the commander, Buzz Aldrin, the pilot, Michael Collins, the guy who'd eventually be left orbiting the moon like the world's loneliest Uber driver. The mood inside the capsule was professional. Decades of training, thousands of hours in simulators, and just a sprinkle of existential dread. Armstrong was famously quiet, the kind of man who could be on fire and still speak in complete sentences. Buzz Aldrin was intense, a little too intense, if we're being honest, and Collins was the balanced one, the one NASA sent to keep the other 2 from strangling each other in low gravity. When the engines ignited, the world held its breath. And then, liftoff. A column of fire, a sound like the sky tearing open, 3 men heading upward at 25,000 miles per hour, all because 2 countries were still trying to outdo each other in the world's most expensive ego contest. It took them 4 days to reach the moon. 4 days of radio chatter, freeze-dried food, and the constant awareness that one wrong button press could make them very, very gone. Armstrong mostly stayed quiet. Aldrin talked a lot. Collins cracked dry jokes from his cramped orbiting seat. Every few hours, Houston would check in, calm Texan voices, speaking to equally calm astronauts, as if they were just doing a grocery run, not rewriting human history. When Apollo 11 finally entered lunar orbit, they saw it. The moon. Up close, it wasn't romantic or silver or glowing. It was gray, dusty, quiet. Basically, it looked like the world's biggest parking lot. But it was their parking lot now. The landing wasn't smooth. Armstrong had to take manual control when the computer, which, by the way, had less processing power than your phone's calculator app, started throwing alarms. They were running low on fuel. They were drifting over a crater field. Buzz was reading out data like an auctioneer. And Armstrong, staying perfectly calm, guided the lunar module, Eagle, down onto a flat patch of ground. The words everyone knows came next. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Applause, tears, collective sighs of relief, except for Michael Collins, still circling above, listening to static. He was basically third-wheeling humanity's first date with another celestial body. After 6 hours, because apparently NASA wanted them to nap first, Armstrong climbed down the ladder. He stepped off the footpad and said very calmly, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," which would have been flawless, except his radio cut out a bit, so it sounded like one small step for man, which grammatically makes no sense. But nobody cared. The first human footprints appeared on the moon. Buzz Aldrin followed, because of course he did, slightly irritated that he wasn't allowed to go first. He described the lunar surface as magnificent desolation, which sounds poetic until you realize it's basically the same thing you'd say when visiting a parking lot at 3 a.m. Together, they set up experiments, planted the American flag, and collected samples of dust that scientists would later spend decades analyzing under microscopes, only to conclude, yes, it's dust. They also took photos, lots of them, mostly of each other, which is why Buzz Aldrin is in most of the famous moon pictures. Armstrong was the one holding the camera, a small historical irony that Buzz never entirely got over. Down on Earth, 500 million people were watching live. Families crowded around black and white televisions, newscasters spoke in hushed tones, and somewhere a Soviet engineer probably threw a wrench at a wall. For once, America was not only first, they were untouchable, unquestionably victorious. It was the kind of moment that makes textbooks skip with joy. But up there on the moon, things were weirdly quiet. The two astronauts could see Earth, a tiny blue marble hanging in the void. Everything they'd ever known, every war, every empire, every annoying neighbor, all contained in one glowing dot. For a few seconds, the whole human race seemed small, peaceful, almost civilized. Then Buzz started bouncing around the surface, and the moment passed. After about 2.5 hours of moon tourism, it was time to leave. They packed up the flag, the rocks, and their own exhaustion, climbed back into Eagle, and launched themselves back into lunar orbit to reunite with Collins. That reunion was probably awkward. Imagine spending days alone circling a dead planet, then 2 dusty coworkers show up and start bragging about walking on it. Collins handled it gracefully, though. He later said he didn't feel left out. He was just relieved someone came back. The trip home was uneventful, which is exactly how you want space travel to be. On July 24th, Apollo 11 splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. The astronauts were fished out by the U.S. Navy, given medical checks, and promptly placed in quarantine,
just in case they brought back alien germs. Spoiler, they didn't, unless you count Buzz Aldrin's ego. The world went wild. Ticker tape parades, medals, television specials. NASA had done it. Kennedy's impossible promise had been fulfilled, though awkwardly by men who weren't alive when he said it. Armstrong instantly became a global icon. He hated it. He was quiet, modest, allergic to celebrity. He gave a few interviews, taught at a university, and mostly avoided the spotlight, which only made him more legendary. Buzz Aldrin, on the other hand, absolutely did not avoid the spotlight. He did talk shows, book tours, commercials. He even punched a moon landing conspiracy theorist once, gently but firmly. Michael Collins stayed chill, wrote beautifully introspective books, and basically became everyone's favorite introverted astronaut. If the space race were a band, Armstrong was the frontman, Aldrin was the lead guitarist with too many opinions, and Collins was the bassist holding it all together. The moon landing was supposed to be the beginning of a grand new era. People talked about lunar bases, Mars missions, maybe even space hotels. Instead, things quieted down. NASA sent 5 more crews to the moon. Each one went a little smoother, gathered a few more rocks, and generated slightly less public excitement. By Apollo 17, people were literally changing the channel. The Soviets, meanwhile, had completely pivoted. They gave up on the moon and focused on space stations, slow, steady progress instead of grand gestures, which honestly was the smarter move. The space race fizzled out, not with a bang, but with budget cuts and exhaustion. By the mid-1970s, both superpowers were realizing that constant one-upmanship was expensive and slightly ridiculous. They even tried something called the Apollo-Soyuz Test Project, where American and Soviet crews.
But of course, we couldn't stay philosophical for long, because the next step was the big one, the moon landing. And that, dear listeners, is where we'll drift next, to the summer of 1969, a year of music festivals, moon boots, and televised miracles. But before we go there, maybe take a breath, because things are about to get historically heavy. Not exciting. We don't do exciting here. Just quietly monumental. Welcome back, space travelers. If you're still awake after the moon landing, congratulations. You've officially outlasted public interest in the Apollo program. When we left off, humanity had taken its first steps on the moon, planted a flag, and then politely gone home. Which, in hindsight, is such a human thing to do. We reached another world, and then got bored. But the story doesn't end there. Not yet. The next few years were a mix of triumphs, accidents, and slow-fading glory. The part of the party where the lights come on and everyone just quietly looks for their coats. Let's drift to Apollo 12, November 1969. 4 months after Armstrong and Aldrin's big moment, another crew was ready to go. The public? Less ready. Television networks debated whether to even air the launch. After all, we'd already seen people walk on the moon. What more could there be? Still, NASA pressed on. The crew? Pete Conrad, Alan Bean, and Richard Gordon. Conrad was shorter, funnier, and a bit of a joker. When he stepped onto the lunar surface, he decided to have a little fun with it. Armstrong's famous line, "One small step for man," had been delivered with calm dignity. Conrad, being Conrad, hopped off the ladder and said, "Whoopee! Man, that may have been a small one for Neil, but that's a long one for me." A solid 10 out of 10 for chaotic energy. Apollo 12 went smoothly, except for one tiny issue. Lightning. 2 bolts struck the rocket during liftoff, briefly knocking out the guidance system. Mission Control calmly told them to flip a switch labeled SCE to aux, which fixed it. Nobody in the cockpit actually knew what that switch did. They just pressed it, and it worked. That's spaceflight for you. Once they reached the moon, they landed precisely near a previous unmanned probe, proving they could aim this thing now. They even brought back pieces of that old probe just to show off. But back home, television ratings were dropping faster than a faulty booster. By Apollo 13, things got complicated. It was 1970. The crew was Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Richard Hayes. Their mission? Land on the moon's Fra Mauro Highlands. Their actual achievement? Not dying. Because about 2 days into the mission, one of the oxygen tanks exploded. The spacecraft shuddered, alarms blared, and the crew's calm Midwestern voices announced, "Houston, we've had a problem." That single sentence became one of the most understated cries for help in history. The next few days were a delicate ballet of improvisation. NASA's engineers on the ground scrambled to keep the astronauts alive, rationing power, rerouting oxygen, and inventing a carbon dioxide filter out of duct tape, socks, and cardboard. It worked. Against all odds, Apollo 13 limped back home safely. The world cheered, but the tone had changed. The moon no longer looked like a place where you could die. Very quietly, very far from home. NASA took the hint. Apollo 14 in 1971 brought back a little optimism. Commander Alan Shepard, America's first astronaut, finally got his chance to walk on the moon. He also did something deeply human. He smuggled a golf club. On live TV, he hit 2 golf balls across the lunar surface, claiming they went miles and miles. In reality, they went about 200 yards, but who's counting? Still, the symbolism was nice. Humanity had evolved from throwing rocks to hitting them recreationally. Apollo 15, later that year, was the first mission to bring a car, the Lunar Roving Vehicle, essentially a glorified battery-powered dune buggy. It allowed astronauts to explore farther and look much cooler while doing it. They found fascinating geological samples, drove around the desolate landscape, and even left behind a small statue, the Fallen Astronaut, a tribute to space explorers who had died. Quiet, poetic, morbidly on brand. By Apollo 16 and 17, even NASA could feel the fatigue. Funding was drying up, the public was distracted by the Vietnam War, Watergate, and the general exhaustion of being alive in the 1970s. Still, Apollo 17 in December 1972 was a grand finale. Commander Eugene Cernan, geologist Harrison Schmitt, and pilot Ron Evans. They spent 3 days on the surface, the longest lunar stay ever. Cernan's final words as he prepared to leave were simple. "We leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return, with peace and hope for all mankind." He climbed up the ladder, looked out over the gray desert, and vanished into history as the last man on the moon. That was over 50 years ago, and no one's been back since. After Apollo ended, NASA had a bit of an identity crisis. The agency had just achieved the greatest technological feat in history, and now Congress wanted to cut their budget, because apparently walking on another world wasn't enough justification for continued funding. So NASA pivoted. If the moon was too expensive, maybe Earth orbit would be more affordable. Thus came Skylab, America's first space station. Launched in 1973, Skylab was basically a leftover rocket stage filled with science experiments, exercise bikes, and confused astronauts. The first crew arrived to find it damaged. Part of the solar panels hadn't deployed, and the interior was getting dangerously hot. They improvised a giant parasol to shade it, fixed the panels, and turned it into a cozy little orbital apartment. Skylab missions were long, quiet, and mostly uneventful.
The astronauts grew beards, took photos of Earth, and complained about the food. So, basically, camping, but in space. Skylab's main legacy was proving that humans could live in space for months without losing their minds. Mostly. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the Soviet Union had been busy too. After losing the moon race, they decided to focus on something they could win: endurance. Their space program, though not glamorous, was quietly impressive. They launched Salyut, a series of modular space stations that would eventually evolve into Mir. The early Salyut missions were, let's say, experimental. Some stations depressurized, some exploded. One crew famously had to fight off a fire in zero gravity. But over time, the Soviets got good at this. They figured out long-term habitation, docking procedures, and space recycling systems. Things that actually mattered in the long run. While the Americans were focused on glory, the Soviets were mastering practicality. By 1975, both sides were tired. Decades of competition had drained their wallets and nerves. So they decided to do something symbolic: work together. The Apollo-Soyuz test project launched that July. One American spacecraft, one Soviet spacecraft. They met in orbit, docked, and shared a handshake through a tiny tunnel, a moment broadcast worldwide as the dawn of space détente. The photos are charming. Two crews floating together, smiling awkwardly, trying to look like lifelong friends while translators hovered nearby. It was the first international space mission, and, quietly, it marked the end of the space race. After that, space became normal. NASA moved on to the Space Shuttle program. Reusable ships meant to make space travel routine. The Soviets kept building bigger and more complex stations. Gone were the dramatic firsts and patriotic speeches. Instead, space became a workplace. The shuttle era had its own rhythm: launch, orbit, repair a satellite, come home, repeat. It was less heroic, more practical, like the difference between conquering Everest and running a ski lodge. But even practicality comes with risk. In 1986, the Challenger disaster reminded everyone that routine and spaceflight don't mix well together. 73 seconds after launch, the shuttle disintegrated on live television. 7 astronauts died. The investigation that followed was grim but necessary. Yet space exploration continued, slower, quieter, humbler. The Soviet Union's Mir space station became humanity's long-term orbital home throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Crews spent months, even a year, living up there. Some grew so accustomed to the station that they got motion sickness on returning to Earth. Mir was imperfect, but enduring, much like the people who built it. And then, of course, came the end of the Cold War. With the Soviet Union collapsing in 1991, the space race officially died of old age and economic stress. NASA and the newly formed Russian Space Agency decided to stop pretending they were enemies and start splitting the grocery bill. The result is the International Space Station, a cooperative project involving the US, Russia, Europe, Japan, and Canada. Basically a floating symbol of what happens when everyone agrees to get along, mostly. It's still up there now, quietly orbiting Earth, full of experiments, selfies, and instant noodles. Looking back, the space race is oddly melancholic. It started with paranoia and propaganda. It ended with partnership and paperwork. What began as a contest to prove ideological superiority somehow transformed into a shared human endeavor. Not perfect, not peaceful, but strangely hopeful. We went from "we must beat them" to "we can't afford to do this alone." And maybe that's the real leap.
Not the one onto the moon, but the one from rivalry to cooperation. If you were to zoom out far enough to see the entire century, it would look something like this. First, humanity learned how to destroy itself with atomic weapons. Then, it learned how to leave the planet that held those weapons. And somewhere between fear and curiosity, we discovered a strange kind of humility. The universe, it turned out, didn't care who won the Cold War. It didn't care about flags or slogans or national anthems. It just kept spinning. Today, the space race has evolved, or maybe regressed, into something new. Private companies now build rockets with corporate logos. Billionaires launch themselves into the upper atmosphere for the price of a small country's GDP. It's still competition, still ego, just wearing sunglasses and tweeting about it. But beneath the vanity, the spirit remains. That same human itch to look up and wonder, what's out there? And even if our motivations are messy, they always have been, the results are still extraordinary. We're building telescopes that can see the beginning of time, rovers that explore Mars, probes that sail beyond the solar system, all because a few nervous scientists once strapped a beeping metal ball to a missile in 1957. So, if you're lying there, half asleep, wondering what it all means, here's the lullaby version. The space race wasn't really about space. It was about us, our need to compete, to create, to prove we matter, even against the backdrop of an infinite void. It was messy, petty, brilliant, and somehow beautiful. We built machines to leave the Earth, but the truth is, we were always just trying to see ourselves from a different angle. And when we finally did, when we saw that tiny blue sphere floating in the dark, we realized something humbling. For all our boundaries and rivalries and noise, we're all on the same small spaceship. Together. So, take a breath. Let your mind drift a little. The engines have cooled, the transmissions are quiet. Above you, the stars are exactly where they've always been. Patient, silent, unimpressed. But they're watching us just the same. Tiny humans who once looked up, got restless, and decided to go see for ourselves.